Yeah.
Welcome to Independent Lens. I'm Edie Falco.
Something had to be done. It had to be done. I mean, we can't get our rights. So, I mean, if you can't get your rights, you just got to take them some kind of way or another, ain't you? Ain't you?
It was a 3-day rebellion that tore the city apart. But this wasn't a civil rights hotspot. This was Rochester, New York. And if it could happen here, everybody knew it could happen anywhere. It was the first time the National Guard had been called out in the North, in a city with the country's lowest unemployment rate. Independent producers Chris Christopher and Carvin Eisen discover that what happened on those hot summer nights is more than an anatomy of a riot. It's a reminder of the continuing forces that can still cause violence anytime, any place in America. July '64, next on Independent Lens.
The lazy, laughing South, with blood on her mouth, and I, who am black, would love her. But she spits in my face, so now I seek the North, the cold-faced North, for she, they say, is a kinder mistress.
The story that we heard was that, it had started at a street dance.
Sponsored by the Northeast Mothers Association.
And there were some people who had come who were uninvited.
And I don't know who or what started it, but all of a sudden,
Some young man had gotten unruly and then...
Police made an arrest.
Rumors started spreading.
But I would say that the alleged biting of the child by the police dog was only the precipitating incident that set this thing off.
Rochester, New York in 1950 had approximately 8,400 blacks in this community.
We came here from Belgrade, Florida.
My family was born in Cordele, Georgia.
When I first came here, to show you how small the town was, I was standing on the corner of Main and Clinton, and an Episcopalian priest by the name of Quentin Primo came up to me and said to me, "You're new in town."
I burnt my hand as a one-year-old child. And evidently there was a nurse who came through Cordele, saw my hand, and told my mother and father about Strong Memorial Hospital. So they came up here with the hopes that I would be treated at Strong and that they just wanted to come north.
The unfortunate thing for me is I had some incident of which I was called an inappropriate name by a little white kid, and I punched him in the face. Well, if you knew anything about the South in those days, that meant real big trouble for me. So my mother decided to take us, bundle us up, and come north.
By rail, by road, by God, millions came north. North to places like Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and yes, Rochester. Rochester, New York.
Old Colonel Nathaniel Rochester certainly picked an ideal location for a city. He really started something. Industries have developed here that have made the name Rochester synonymous with quality and precision manufacturing. A veritable who's who in American business. Industrial pioneers such as George Eastman Edward Bausch and Henry Long founded local concerns whose diversified products are now bought and sold everywhere.
Rochester, the home of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, is a mid-sized city in upstate New York with a progressive social justice history and a reputation for jobs. Rochester drew people like a magnet. The black population swelled by 300% between 1950 and 1960 and continued to grow.
Leaving the South and going to the region of the North meant being respected as citizens and as human beings, and also the chance to live in more modern and decent housing, being able to pursue their aspirations for career, for education for their young people. That was a very, very heavy expectation.
Right after World War II, we changed from manufacture of war materials to peacetime materials. Kodak was a major employer at that time, and Haloid was about to become Xerox during the 1950s, and so there were many high-tech positions that people could take.
I came here just because I could get a job on the paper, like a lot of others who worked on the paper then, Times Union. But it was not a very, it was not a very sort of welcoming town to outsiders. There was a very clear establishment. And the town was always more prosperous, Rochester, than all the other cities in upstate. And everybody was very smug about that.
The community is fully aware of the financial facts of life and the methods of making an economic area prosperous.
One local newspaperman coined the phrase and literally wrote the book that put Rochester in its place. Kurt Gerling's notorious Smugtown, USA.
Kurt Gerling was talking about Rochester as smug town because he felt they were very complacent, very sedentary. They saw their lives as very well set. They went to work for major corporations. Their children would be able to get a job in the same place. They made a good living. They had very good culture here in the arts, much of that owing to George Eastman's generosity too. They knew their children would go on to college, and so they did not see any disruption, and they didn't see any need for themselves to change.
Rochester had its smugness. I think the Republicans had control of the city. There was a smugness in that regard. The Democrats could not get to first base. Rochester was a money town, and with its money, it literally said, we don't really have any problems here.
Everybody here was so prosperous. Unemployment rate here was 2%, that kind of thing. 2 to 3%. 3% was all outlandish. Everybody worked at Kodak, and in January they got a huge bonus, and they went and had all the furniture stores had huge, big sales, and they went and bought cars and furniture. Everybody was rich. Nobody wanted to rock the boat. Nobody wanted to hear about the ones who weren't rich.
A tradition of fine craftsmanship developed here, attracting quality industries and quality people alike. Skilled industries, skilled people. Clean industries, clean people. Stable industries, stable people. Diversified products.
We had a real wonderful economy in those years in Rochester. All the industry was doing very well. We had skilled and semi-skilled jobs.
When you go back and you look at Rochester, that a lot of the problems that we had was due to the fact that you had this mentality here that this is our city, and I don't care what you say, we're going to run this city the way we want to. We don't recognize any changes that are taking place. And it was that people had their head in the sand in this community.
The newcomers settled in two neighborhoods, the old 3rd Ward and across town in the 7th. The poverty-stricken 7th Ward, with Joseph Avenue at its heart, was home to waves of immigrants over the years, and the only neighborhood with public housing.
And the people coming in those years throughout the 50s were primarily unskilled, so that created some different kinds of problems, not only employment, but housing problems. You know, you can't draw any comparison to the blacks leaving the South and the Germans, Irish, and Italians that came, because they came and they had ties usually in the community.
That's in large part mythical. For example, black people were much more culturally similar to white people in Rochester. They spoke the same language, they knew the same customs, they grew up in the same country. And they also were not dramatically less educated than the Europeans who were coming, because these were poor Europeans who were coming. But I would argue it was rooted in the lack of will to welcome these people in the same way they had welcomed whites who were coming over from Europe. They did fairly well there.
When we came here, we lived at, I think it was 417 Ormond Street, a very mixed neighborhood. Italians were there, Jews were there, Irish were there, blacks were there.
Well, I remember the neighborhood as a wonderful place. It was kind of a melting pot of all kinds of people from all different places, I guess, all over the world.
We would walk from the projects right to Joseph, and you would get a spot and stand and watch people, because Joseph was the place where people came and shopped. You had appliance stores. I mean, anything you needed in the neighborhood, you had.
Papa Mangione had a grocery store on the corner of Martin and Grant Street. And the store was actually attached to our house. And so my father would eat dinner and keep the door open so he could see who was coming into the store. And I don't remember him ever really having a complete meal without having to get up and go out to sell some kids some penny candy, or somebody came in to get something.
The Mangione store was, you go in, Mr. Mangione, you know, looked like he had this feeling. You would, and it sounds funny, and I'm dating myself, but you know, you can get a donut for a nickel. And you can go in, and we would go in sometimes after practice, and you would look at the donut, then you look at a piece of cake, and you look, well, I'll take that. Well, then sometimes he would say, well, you know, you're a good boy. You get both for the price of one.
One of the delightful aspects of the neighborhood that I love now, even in retrospect, was that there was really an idea of taking care of each other. You know, we looked out for each other, the small things.
I remember I said that there were Jews in the neighborhood, there were blacks in the neighborhood, there were Italians in the neighborhood, there were Irish in the neighborhood. Those are the major groups, but you know what? None of us looked at color as such. There are people who lived outside of our neighborhood who treated us differently, even those who were not black and brown.
When you come right down to it, what brings a prospective industry to a prospective location? More than anything else, it is an enlightened workforce. In this respect, Rochester is second to none, for clean industries, that is, for industries requiring a high percentage of professional, technical, skilled, and semi-skilled personnel. Naturally, a prospective industry...
Rochester enjoyed a robust economy and one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation. More than 10,000 jobs were unfilled, yet the newcomers soon discovered that jobs and opportunity were not available to all.
Rochester was just beginning to become what I call the booming metropolis. The factories certainly were not open to minorities. It was just a common knowledge that you just did not get hired at certain factories in Rochester, New York. There was not that open door policy. It was, as a matter of fact, a laughable matter among the minority community that if you put your application in at Kodak, Bosch and Lomb, Xerox, or any of the corporations, that your application went into file 13, which was the wastebasket.
I can remember going to Kodak, who is now laying off 4,500 people as of just yesterday. Going there when I got out of college, 2 years of college, because my family was poor, as I've said previously, but wanted to help my mother raise the rest of my family. Going to Kodak 3 days a week, always before 8 o'clock in the morning for 6 months and could not get a job. And eventually I asked the question of them, because they asked me first, why don't you go someplace else to try and find a job? I say I am the other 2 days, but Kodak's a place that I would like to work. Most black people in those days got into Kodak behind a broom.
There were jobs, but everybody couldn't get a job. My father used to come home, and I know sometimes his friends would tease him that, hey, you're a garbage man. But like he said, but it feeds my family. So the type jobs people had were, let's be honest, they were strenuous, not the best paying jobs, but they were jobs that, you could work and take care of your family.
With its smugness, Rochester was the last major city in New York to build public housing. In 1964, 35% of the housing was still classified as deteriorating and dilapidated.
Rochester was predictably, or characteristically, the last city in upstate New York to get a public housing project. They resisted public housing to the bitter end. There were 3 or 4 projects in Syracuse, half a dozen in Buffalo, federal and state and so forth. Utica had them, everybody's had them, we had none. And well, you can say now that public housing worked so badly that maybe that was smart, but it wasn't. That wasn't the reason. It was resistance to the idea that they needed public housing and resistance to government programs.
Most of the blacks lived in probably about a 12-block area in the 3rd Ward, and I say a 12-block area in the 7th Ward.
I think housing is the big concern. I think it's one of the major concerns because this area here is one of the most run-down areas in the city, and the houses are infested with roaches and rats and dilapidated properties and so forth. And
there were problems with regard to housing. As a matter of fact, there were many blacks who wanted to move out of certain blighted areas, but found that the realtors were not willing to assist them.
Attempts to break out of those prescribed boundary conditions were very difficult. For example, in 1954, while a graduate student and looking for housing for my family, the wife and I answered ads to 69 ads for 69 apartments, and we were refused for all of them.
A lot of the houses are owned by speculators, and they cut them up from sort of a house that once held 1 family in 6 rooms to maybe 3 2-room apartments. And sometimes you find as many as 6 and 7 children living with their parents in 2 or 3 rooms.
This one house at, I think it was number 48 Gregg Street at that time, had 16 families living in this one house. And what they had done was taken the rooms and they chopped them up and they put a refrigerator and a 2-plate burner, and they called them studio apartments.
And my younger sister, she had to go to the hospital because she was bitten by a rat. So it was a time when your mother and father would wake up during the middle of the night, come to your room, check on you because of, rats.
Well, I'm convinced that many of the areas where our people are living and where we have to live, where our children have to live, it's just inhuman for human beings to be there. It's a shame and it's a reproach upon any community that call itself a civilized community to allow such conditions to exist.
Everybody in our community, black and white, knew that something was drastically wrong in this community. There was a quiet rage.
Well, we knew that there were some problems. We were moving to try and meet some of those problems. For instance, we set up the police advisory board because of the question of the way the police were handling things.
The only thing I'll tell you is this, though, I'm sick and tired of this police brutality. They had no cause, and they got a review board for that, to find out why, if there's any police brutality.
Well, as a matter of fact, you're looking at one of the sponsors of the Police Review Board. And I did it too, and I had a brother and 2 nephews that were policemen, and the police didn't like that. But I thought that it was a small price to pay for better police community understanding.
I think back in the 50s and early 60s, we were living in a police state. John, my husband, and I witnessed, along with many others in our group in the community, witnessed police brutality.
What's it feel like when someone accuses you of being brutal? Sound like a song at a hit parade. How about you?
I feel the same way. I haven't seen any police brutality. In fact, I think all of us have bent over backwards to avoid it.
Police brutality, of course, that was used pretty loosely by people that got in trouble with the police, and they thought it was a good way to go. But sometimes there was some legitimacy to it.
And you were taught this, you know, you didn't want to be arrested. And as you got older and you listened to the older people talk, number one, there was a feeling that if you were arrested, the police would beat you.
I think the police believed that they had to put the fear of God into people.
On one occasion, a policeman entered a church during an 11 o'clock service on Sunday morning, fully garbed, gun, cap, dog, during an 11 o'clock Sunday morning service.
In my entire upbringing, the dogs were the number one subject that I knew, I would say, most of the people thought about, talked about, wanted something, you know, be done about it, because that was a bad situation.
A lot of inner city folk didn't like police dogs. And on the famous night of July 24th, that came home to roost in a way.
It is as though we are going to go after animals, and unfortunately, that is how some whites view blacks in America, as animals. And they feel that it is perfectly okay for police dogs to be used.
Police dogs, you know, they served a very good, useful purpose in many ways. But it was unfortunate that some of the people in the inner city thought that it was strictly designed against them. And that wasn't the true reason. We were trying to get at whoever was breaking the law and send the dogs into very difficult, dangerous situations. And rather than risk a life, we were risking a dog, but those dogs were treasured, and they were smart and good and well-trained. And so sometimes when you do good, you have people that get upset.
But understand this, the dogs were good dogs. But the dogs took their commands from the officer. And if the officer's bad, that means the dog then is inappropriately abusing people. And I don't care whether Frank Lambert and anybody else say what they say. I can tell you, as a youngster, I saw it.
Let's face it, in every community across the country, the police were viewed as the power to keep blacks in their place, and they were used that way.
That happened in Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, the Bronx, you know, East St. Louis, Gary, Indiana, Chicago. These were fairly common patterns, you see. And I think this is what's often missed. And this is how the hopes of black people were dashed. Because they would say, all right, if it was just Rochester, we'll leave Rochester and we'll go to Syracuse. We'll go to Buffalo. Or we'll leave altogether and go to Gary, Indiana. But what they heard and seen from cousins and relatives, this was the pattern.
Times change. And you either change your city to fit them, or they'll change your city, often unpleasantly, more often unprofitably.
There was a group of us that had met at my home that evening for a meeting, and there was about 20 of us, And what we were meeting that night to see if we could curb the rumors that were running rampant in the community that we were headed for trouble.
It was a Friday night, and I was home packing, getting ready to leave the next day for Miami, Florida, to give a speech at the National League of Cities.
I was home, just about to go to sleep. And I got a call from one of our photographers. And he had been listening to a wave of broadcasts, of transmissions by the police, indicating to him that this was more than a Friday night, typical Friday night in July.
We, of course, had been away for an overnight, as I recall, and as we entered the city, we overheard that something was brewing in the Baden-Ormond section.
It was like a big block party. Everybody was having fun and enjoying themselves. Randy was having fun, a little bit more fun than the rest of us, you know, and unfortunately got a little intoxicated.
So along around 10 o'clock at night, I got a call from the Deputy Commissioner of Public Safety, and he told me there's some problems down on Joseph Avenue, and it's quite serious, but I want you to know, and that if it gets more serious, we'll be back to you.
I called him back and I said, "Are you still hearing this stuff?" He says, "Yeah, it's worse than ever." I said, "Pick me up right away." And I have to tell you, as we approached the city, we heard police sirens wailing everywhere. We didn't know what we were going to get into. I had never been in a riot before, but here it struck me was going to be a baptism of fire.
Some say the crowd went wild when the police used excessive force to arrest 19-year-old Randy Manigault. Others say Randy's friends interfered with police business. Tempers snapped, fists flew, rumors swirled, a child was bit by a dog, a pregnant woman was slapped. Whatever it was out of control. Some said it was an uprising, a riot, urban combustion. Constance Mitchell said it was a keg of dynamite, and all it needed was a match.
I mean, people were like they were wild. It was almost like they had gone insane.
The riots grew out of an incident following a street dance at the corner of Joseph Avenue and Nassau Street just before midnight. A policeman had tried to arrest a man for public intoxication. Negroes claimed a canine dog bit one of them, setting off the explosion.
Rumors started spreading that a police dog bit a young girl. That was never substantiated by anyone.
Well, Warren, to tell you what caused it is like trying to determine the raindrop that caused the flood or the snowflake that caused the blizzard. But I would say that the alleged biting of the child by the police dog was only the precipitating incident that set this thing off.
This woman needs some air. Now, when you move back so this woman gets some air. When you move back.
On Central Avenue, in front of the railroad station, a Negro woman had fallen in front of or been struck by a car. She was one of a milling throng of whites and blacks who appeared ready for a pitched battle.
Send him back to Africa. Hey, hey, hey.
I sat there and watched them, the black community on one side, in front of the train station, the white community on the other side. And so incidents went back and forth and slurs went back and forth and were screaming at each other.
This was a scene right out of a movie. And to be there with the lights playing and these fire hoses hitting people as they walked across the street or ran away from the scene under police direction, you know.
Right
right, Sid. Keep moving them out. Careful, careful. All right, let's get the hose up.
Was something that I recalled having seen on television in other cities, but could not imagine that I was seeing it right here in my own city.
There was foul language. The crowds had gathered. Police were everywhere. They were sounding off, and they were beginning to move toward downtown, but the police, of course, contained them. So they started setting fires and breaking storefronts, glasses, and all of that in their immediate neighborhood. And it was a terrible thing. It was terrible.
Well, Chief Lombard came down. He was coming down, I believe, it was Joseph Avenue around Central Park there.
Lombard had tried single-handedly to quell the disturbances by reasoning with the crowd.
He had his mic on, telling everybody to get off the street, go home.
But they spat on him and threw rocks at him, 2 of which badly bruised him, and either of which could have killed him.
And they surrounded his car. Just turned his car over, throwing, wow, throwing rocks, and I'm surprised he didn't get killed.
It was astonishing to see that. There, encapsulated in that one scene, was the brutality, the violence, and the danger that was all about us.
You knew the shop owners. You know, you knew people in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden now you're seeing their store being looted, their store being, you know, burned later on. You have mixed feelings. You know, you don't want that to happen. But then, you know, you keep your mouth shut that, you know, hey, I can't stand and tell this guy, don't go in that store and do this, you know, because I don't know what his problems are. I don't know what's motivating him. So it was a time where, you know, it was a sad time in terms of why did this happen in my neighborhood?
It was a very tense situation. And, hey, you're going through this for the first time. You know, nobody had a script to follow. You just had to follow whatever your best judgment was.
About 2 o'clock in the morning, as every policeman was being called to duty, Chief William Lombard delivered instructions on the use of riot weapons.
Armed with your night clubs, if you stick together, you'll be able to move this mob along.
Some of these people may know what we've got here. We're only going to use this in case of an emergency. We've got an emergency, but we want it worse than it is before we start using tear gas or any other weapons.
They had turned over Police Chief Lombard's car, so we heard about that, and we wanted to find out if he was hurt because he was a good friend of ours. We went down to the Public Safety Commissioner's office, and that's when we found out how the city fathers felt about black Rochesterians. The names that they were calling us in that place, it was a disgrace.
And so we had all kinds of discussions that early evening, and people were stunned. How could this happen in Rochester? You know, an affluent eastern city that had a reputation of being very benevolent and generous.
The majority of Rochester awoke that morning to the stunning news of the night's events, while those most closely affected struggled with the broken reality they faced. The heart of the neighborhood was ripped out. Joseph Avenue would never be the same.
Mr. Casentino, who do you think is responsible for all of this?
The morning after, it's just like a drunk. There's the hangover. There's regret on the part of the people who took part in it.
It was like a bomb had been dropped.
It was a sight to behold.
Les, that store behind us is yours. There's quite a bit of damage there. Where were you when the rioting and the looting took place?
Upstairs listening to all this going on. Looting,
knocking everything all over, damaging the store, breaking the windows. We sat up there taking it all in.
The scene was almost beyond comprehension. Stores were empty and looted of their goods. Fixtures were torn apart. TVs and appliances were smashed and scattered across sidewalks that were littered with glass, pieces of brick, and debris. Remarkably, some stores, like Mangioni's grocery store, were left untouched. Others were completely destroyed.
It was the young people that stole the televisions and, and stuff like that. But it was just the young people that stole milk, pop, bread, meat. And all I did was sit on my front porch and cry.
You were shocked when you saw Joseph the night after the riot. Because, all of a sudden now, it was stores, no window pane. Clothing stores, empty.
He can't say. He's too filled up. He's too broken up to realize the damage. He had a good thing, and it's too bad.
We knew about the troubles that had happened over on Joseph Avenue and farther over from there. We had heard about it through the media. I certainly wouldn't have gone into a dangerous situation knowing that it was a dangerous situation any more than you might try to get close to a fire or something that might explode.
You're going to stay in business, or you're going to fix it?
I think this will be the coup de grace. I think this is going to drive us on.
I don't think anyone envisioned, the effect, that night. When the darkness vanished and the light comes, how was the neighborhood going to look? And people were talking in terms of hurt feelings in terms of our neighborhood. That was the biggest, talk after riots. Look, what are we going to do to our neighborhood? Look what happened to our neighborhood. It wasn't a feeling of we got you back or anything like that. It was no, look what happened to our neighborhood.
Reverend Andrew Gibson, Reverend Father Quentin Primo, and I, and a few others, we walked the streets that night, and they recognized me, and they said, "Reverend, we're coming over to your side tomorrow night." And lo and behold, they did.
We went down with a group of ministers, and I think it was about 8 of us, went down to the Public Safety Commissioner's office to ask if we could have, because they had talked about having a curfew, if we could have special passes so that we could go out and talk to the young people. And someone left the intercom on in the inner office, and what we heard was, let those niggers do what they want to do. But the minute if they step outside of the boundaries of Clarissa Street or Jefferson Avenue and head towards Main Street, shoot to kill.
Well, number one, I never heard such a thing and wouldn't believe it. Our police were, instructed that that was the last resort. And it never got to that, thank God. And so I think that was a total fallacy.
I hereby order a curfew in the city of Rochester to go into effect at 8 p.m. on July 25th, 1964, and 8 p.m. each night thereafter until the state of emergency shall be terminated.
Actually, it was spontaneous on Friday night and all that. And it was a curfew that was put out for Saturday, but Saturday was planned for Saturday after curfew. See, there's a difference on that. Because of what happened on Friday night, that's when things started getting organized, as to what was going to happen on Saturday, when it was going to happen, how it was going to happen, that type of thing. It was like, okay, you got Friday night and you think it's over and it's done with, but it's not.
On Saturday evening, we were sitting on the front porch because it was very warm, and
we heard the first brick thrown. I tell you, it was like a circus atmosphere. We tried to walk the streets. They had the state police marching the streets. They wouldn't let us off that porch.
Despite the curfew and closing of downtown and all liquor stores, violence broke out across town in the 3rd Ward that night with an intensity that pushed the limits. Angry mobs swarmed the streets. Molotov cocktails were tossed. Rocks and bottles rained down from rooftops.
We had people who were up on roofs who had 20, 30 cocktails, bombs to throw down on top of the cars because they knew they were coming.
There was a great deal of hate coming from both sides. I think that there were those angry young blacks who were furious, and I do mean furious.
Something had to be done. It had to be done. I mean, we can't get our rights. So, I mean, if you can't get your rights, you just got to take them some kind of way or another, ain't you? Ain't you?
I picked up everything I could. I picked up rocks and threw them. I picked up bottles and threw them. Whatever I could get my hand on that wasn't nailed down.
And yet, on the other hand, you could see the venom coming from the police in retaliation and the anger and the movement, trying to corral and move about and push people back and all of that. Oh, yes, there was hate. It was a terrible time in the city of Rochester.
What's it been like out here these last few nights?
Well, it hasn't been pleasant, that's for sure. It's been rough, busy. We'll be glad when it's all over, I guess. Don't we all feel that way?
That's for sure. It is tiresome and surprising, and it really hurts for the city of Rochester.
It's all because of cops, I think. In a way, it's not necessary on this side of town. Across town, it started over there, see, and over here it's just for kicks, more or less.
As far as an opinion is concerned, I think it's wrong in this sense because it's not gaining us anything. It's not gaining the colored people anything. It's just making us, putting us farther back in the hole because somebody's got to make up for this.
We all love him. We all love him. Right behind him.
Mr. Castantino, do you think the people in this neighborhood are responsible, or?
Well, I don't think it's the people in the neighborhood because I got along with the people in the neighborhood. I think it's more the people that's coming to out of towners.
People wanted to blame it on outside agitators, but when you look at that list of people who were arrested, who was arrested? They were Rochesterians.
Nearly 1,000 were arrested. At first, the police focused their attention on those who appeared to be leading or agitating the rioters.
They just grab you and throw you in there and take you downtown. They had some real mean intentions when it came to me.
City Manager Porter Homer's official report indicated that the majority of those arrested were between 20 and 40 years old, employed, and had no prior record of arrest. 15% were white.
When you have uprisings that last for days, this is more than a riot. A riot is when people can't get into the football stadium or they're locked out of the concert and they have a ticket, been drinking too much beer. They let off steam for a couple hours and then that's it. But when this goes on for days, it tells you that there's deep sense of social injustice that people are responding to.
When you looked on the street, there was grandmothers, fathers, uncles, aunties, young people, because folk were actually, and they didn't look at this as a riot, they looked at it as a rebellion.
I was ready to stop because of the damage to the community. It was strange. I think it was Sunday, I was on my way to church. It was like I was walking through a war zone.
There was a lot of blame and finger pointing after the riots. I had been asked to go on Channel 8 and to tell my people to condemn them. And I refused to do that. I went on air and I said, I understand what caused this, but it doesn't need to continue.
Sunday afternoon, July 26th, as the emotional weight of these awful happenings and the heat of summer were causing the population a unique discomfort, there occurred in the city yet another sensationally tragic thing. A helicopter crashed on the sidewalk in front of 452 Clarissa Street. It burned fiercely, and the house became an inferno.
Curtis Green, could you describe what you saw, please? Yes, I saw the helicopter come over, and he got at the top of the building, and he paused for a minute, and he was determined to sit right in between, right in the highway there, right in the street, please. Yeah. And he was a little too close, and his one side bumped the top of the building, then it made him quill. Then he fell right down in the street. See? A part of the helicopter hit that house that's burning? Yeah, hit the roof right there. And then he fell to the next part of the building, and he hit to the ground.
Disturbances and riots, they tax your community to the fullest and your manpower, and we didn't have a lot of manpower, enough to meet the problems.
With the situation out of hand for 2 straight nights and apprehension growing that more riots were apt to take place Sunday night, city, county, and state officials agreed that despite the nearly 1,000-man police force on the scene, the National Guard had to be called out.
I came to Rochester because the state has committed some 450 state troopers here, and I have called out the National Guard. As governor and as a citizen, I deplore this kind of violence. Regardless of the objective, it cannot be justified. This is not the way to achieve progress in a democratic society.
Rockefeller emphasized that martial law was not declared, but rather that the guardsmen were there to help weary local and state police in controlling the rioting and the looting.
This was the first time the National Guard was called out in a northern city.
Officials feel the worst is over for now, but it is guarded optimism. Next weekend, they say, will provide the acid test. The city is now in a state of shock and embarrassment, as well as a state of emergency. Of the first 25 persons we asked for comments in the downtown section tonight, 23 refused to say a word. This is Morton Dean reporting from Rochester for WCBS TV News.
This is Darrell Porter, who's president of the Matadors, a group of boys in this area. Darrell, it's been 2 weeks since the riots. I guess you were involved in them, weren't you?
Yes.
What did you do?
Well, I was doing about what everybody else was doing. I was breaking the law, throwing bottles, breaking windows, robbing places and things like that. Because people in Rochester are getting tired of all these slum houses and the brutality from the policemen, the way they beat on teenagers and the way they yell at you if you're standing on the corner, and the treatment they do to you when they get you down to the police station themselves.
To this day, I know that just from friends and associates in our community, I'll hear it time and time again that things have gotten so much better, but they still carry perceptions and anger based on how things may have been, decades ago. So something that may have happened inappropriately or just clear-cut wrong in 1964, to this day, can be carried with a person that just has a very difficult time with the police.
So we just work consciously over the years to break down these attitudes on both sides and create a more harmonious environment in which effective police work can be done.
Well, Darrell, did you really think that by robbing a store and by throwing bricks, breaking the law that way, that you were going to achieve anything?
When all the riot was going on, this made the mayor and the city get up on their high horses and wanted to come to see what was going on and why it was going on. So since it happened, now everybody's getting down to talk about it, and I think there should be a little bit more change in this world.
The riots of the 60s was a crude awakening for America. And I think that for the first time in history, along with the assassinations and all of the things that were taking place within this country, I think people came to the realization that if we really were going to survive in America, we had better come to the table and sit down and start dialoguing and begin to try to get some type of understanding of who we are, where we are and where we're going.
The events of July '64 did bring people to the table, and many conditions, including policing, improved over time, but many things did not.
In the 60s, the problem was health, education, jobs. At the infancy of the 21st century, the problems, health, education, jobs.
Today, large areas of the city are plagued with high rates of unemployment, infant mortality, and teen pregnancy. The per capita number of children living in poverty is the highest in the state and among the highest in the nation. Some things are actually worse now in the riot areas than they were in 1964. Home ownership is down. A larger percentage of the population fails to complete high school. At the present time, only 25% of Rochester's 9th graders will graduate at the end of their senior year.
I think that we had too much crisis now to be smug. I think we've been shaken out of our smugness, but I still find that there are people who want to do business in the old way, which is a sort of an insider kind of a game. It still amazes me that in the year 2004, that I can go to meetings in this town of the power elite, and I'll be the only person of color in the room, and it's very clear that if I weren't mayor, I wouldn't be in that room.
Right, and that oftentimes as blacks ascend to positions of power or authority in the system, in the city, they find it's a kind of empty victory because the corporations and the tax base leaves the city as whites move out to the suburbs and as plants relocate and disperse their operations to other areas of the country. So it's a kind of empty victory. It's a kind of crude hoax. They now have political office, but they have to minister over a much more dramatic social problems than was before, with a dramatically decreased revenue base. That's the crisis of the black politician.
I think that most people in this nation are now at peace within their own hearts with people of other races and other cultures. And that if they cannot welcome them, they at least can live peaceably and respectfully with them.
There is still a desire to define advantage and social status around race. There is still the residual belief in this society in concepts of white supremacy and black inferiority.
We're in the middle of a social revolution within this country. And I think that the same thing that happened in Rochester Friday night can happen in any other community in America.
Throughout this community, there is still that feeling that it could happen again.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.